Okay, welcome everyone. We are going to be doing 2 chapters tonight. For those who have 70 faces, we're doing chapters 25 and 26. We're doing chapters 24 and 25. The first one we're doing is Kal V'Chomer. So in the morning prayers, before we start Psukei Zimra, there is in most Sidurim, the list of 13 principles from Rabbi Yishmael as how we understand the Torah. This is it's like a miniature of 70 faces. This is much more halachic in format. The 13 principles of darshaning the Torah from Rabbi Yishmael. It's the Talmudic logic that is used, and one of the 13 is Kal V'Chomer. Now this is used, I'll explain, this is used in finding really the simple, literal, halachic Jewish law understanding of the text, but it's also used in the allusions or the allegories or the metaphors or the mystical tradition of Judaism as well. So what is a Kal V'Chomer? Kal means light and Chomer means heavy. And this is a type of logic where it can go either way, from light to heavy or heavy to light, depending on the circumstances. But if, let's say, a certain circumstance cannot work out in what's called a easy or a light case, how much more so will it not work out in a more complicated or heavier sense? That's the idea of Kal V'Chomer. It's like pure logic. So we're going to go through a number of examples. And the first one, Rashi even comments that this is a Kal V'Chomer. And he mentions that in the 5 books of Moses, in the Chumash, there are 10 Kal V'Chomers in the text itself, not the rabbis interpreting or laying upon it, but in the text itself, there are 10 Kal V'Chomers. So one of them is the first one we'll bring. We're on page 223, for those who want to follow, is that when Moshe came back to Egypt after God revealed at the burning bush that Moshe was to be the leader, and he said, go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And God already told him that Pharaoh won't listen. And he won't listen in order that I can multiply my wonders in Egypt. So Moshe goes back and he goes to Pharaoh. And, first, when he came back, he came to the people, to Israel, and in a sense, put forward his credentials as the leader chosen by God, and that God was now was ready to listen to them. And God was ready to redeem them. And so what happened? So Moshe went in and he said to Pharaoh, let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh didn't listen. And not only that, he doubled the work. They would now have to go out and gather straw themselves to make the mortar. And so when Moshe went back to the people, they were already not ready to listen to him. Because he had come with these big plans, these big promises from God, and it turned out to be worse. And so so God comes and tells Moshe, go back to Paro and tell him to let my people go. So Moshe says, Israel won't listen to me. How much more so won't Paro? And so Rashi comments, this is one of the examples of a Kal V'Chomer. So, because you would think Israel would be ready to listen to Moshe, and Paro would be like the heavy case. So if Israel was not ready to listen to Moshe, how was Paro going to listen? So this, Rashi tells us, is one of the 10 Kal V'Chomers in the Torah. I'll just mention again that usually this is used in Talmudic logic in different disputes about Jewish law, but it's also used in the more philosophical delving into the text to understand the deeper meanings. So that's our first example. The next one is a very important one, an extremely important one. I'll begin with last week with Parashat Mishpatim. And in my estimation, one of the most important Rashis in the entire Chumash is at the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim. The verse says, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the laws, the ordinances that you will put before them. So on the words put before them, Rashi comments from a midrash where God says to Moshe, don't think that you can just tell the people what the law is, and once or twice, and they'll memorize it, and you've fulfilled your obligation. Rather, you should teach them ta'amei mitzvot, the deeper reasons for the mitzvot, and you should put it before them k'shulchan aruch. Now, for people who know, around 500 years ago, Rabbi Yosef Karo compiled to this day, what's called like the backbone of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, based on this Rashi, where the Midrash says you should put it before them like a set table. Shulchan Aruch is a set table. In other words, don't expect them just to memorize the law and that's all you have to do. No, you have to teach them the deeper meanings. The reason this is so important is, at least from my experience, we've lost a good part of the last 2 or 3 generations of Jews in a type of Jewish education where at most, young Jews, who go to Sunday school or have their bar mitzvah lessons, are told, this is what you do. This is what you say. This is what you do. This is what the law is. Without any real deep explanation of why we're doing anything. And unfortunately, we've lost generations because of this kind of education. So this Rashi is saying, Moshe, no, you have to teach them the deeper meanings. So that is an introduction to the Kal V'Chomer that we are going to discuss now. And that is in the beginning of the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. Vayikra means, and he called. And so the book of Vayikra begins with God calling Moshe to come into the Ohel Mohed, into the tabernacle, and to begin and to dedicate the Mishkan on the first day of the month of Nisan. And so Rashi gets into a whole discussion did everyone hear God calling to Moshe? or did only Moshe hear? And what kind of a voice was it? Was it a loud booming voice, or was it a voice, again, that just only Moshe heard? The conclusion is it was a call to Moshe alone, even though Hasidic teachings is that this is a call for everyone to come into what's called avodat Hashem, come into serving God. This is a call to every person in every generation. Then Rashi addresses another question. The Torah is made up of, I'm going to call them paragraphs or passages. And in the Torah, they're distinguished by how many spaces there are between these passages. And there are big passages, meaning long passages. And they're sometimes short, just even one verse will be surrounded on both sides by 9 empty letter spaces. So Rashi asks, he had already established, I'm sorry, I didn't say this. Rashi already established this was not a one-time call to Moshe. Rashi learns out from sources that every time that God spoke to Moshe, he first called to him, and Vayikra is an endearing language. In other words, he called to him kind of as an introduction that I'm about to reveal something new in the Torah. So Rashi asks, was it only the long passages that God called him, or even the short ones? And so Rashi comes to the conclusion, again, based on sources, it was only the long passages. So then Rashi asks a great question. So if so, why are there small passages to begin with? Why is there these spaces if God isn't calling him? So Rashi says it's in order to give Moshe time to meditate on what he was just taught, or preparing him to meditate on what he will be taught. So Rashi ends with a Kal V'Chomer, where he says, if Moshe needed time to meditate on what God was teaching him, how much more so an ordinary person like us? So that's a Kal V'Chomer. But here it's the heavy case. If Moshe needs time to meditate on what he's learning, how much more so do we need? So along with that just being a beautiful Kal V'Chomer, it's teaching us something so important, because just because we're human beings, we're very finite. Most of us do not have the type of memories that we can just learn one time and it's integrated in and we got it. Most of us have to review over and over and over again. That's why it says someone who reviews their learning for the 101st time, there's no comparison to if this person only learned it 100 times. That's how many times we have to go over our learning. Most people. Other people have like perfect memory. So what happens a lot is we read and we hear classes and we watch videos, and then we go on to the next class and the next book and the next chapter, and we never take the time to actually sit with what we just learned and really think about it, contemplate it, meditate on it. So this Rashi is saying if Moshe had to also meditate on what he was learning in order for him to integrate it. How much more so do we have to? So this is a very, very important point for all of us, is that whatever we're learning, we need to go over our learning. And I mean, I hope everyone's enjoying the WhatsApp where we're putting the classes on so people can go over them. And we're putting supplementary materials because we need this. We need this to properly integrate what we learn. Okay, the next example it's a short one, but really important. It's on page 225. And there is a discussion about the sin of the spies. The story, as everyone probably knows, is we're about to come into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe sends 12 spies. They come back after 40 days, and 10 of them, they first say it's a beautiful land. It's an amazing land. Here are the fruits that we brought back. And this is the story where 2 people had to carry one cluster of grapes. They were so huge. And to this day, that is the symbol of the Ministry of Tourism in Israel. All over Israel, you'll see the symbol of 2 people with a staff and this cluster of grapes that they're carrying back. But then they said, it's beautiful, but the people are too strong. We will not be able to conquer it, and forget it. We're not going to be able to go into the land. And the people said, well, let's pick new leaders and go back to Egypt. And because of that, that caused us to wander in the desert for another 39 years until that generation had, between the men between 20 and 60 had passed away. So there's a discussion in the Gemara about the consequences of speaking lashon hara, evil speech. So one of the sages said, what we can learn from this, if we see how dire the consequences were from speaking evil speech about rocks and dirt, how much more so is it a terrible thing to speak evil speech about another person. So this is a Kal V'Chomer. In other words, if all of Israel suffered 39 years of wandering in the desert because of one night of them saying something terrible about the land of Israel, and really about God, because as if God could not bring us into the land, but it was about the land. So the sage says, look what happened. And they spoke lashon hara about rocks and trees and mountains and streams. Look what could happen if you speak evil speech, lashon hara, about another person. And there's a parable. What is evil speech compared to? Someone going to the top floor of a very tall building and taking a feather pillow and ripping it open, and the feathers spread everywhere in the wind. The wind takes them and they're spread quite literally all over the neighborhood, maybe even all over the city. And so it's explained that this is what speaking evil about another person. Once that energy is in the world, you can't retrieve it. It's there, it's out there. People talk. very quickly, when evil speech is talked, it spreads, and a person, even if they want to take it back, how can they find all of the feathers that are now spread everywhere? The next example is also from a Talmudic discussion, and that's on page 227. And here the discussion is, here they're formulating the law. The question is raised when a Torah is taken out of the ark and among the community in a shul, do you have to stand for it? That's the question. Well, we know from our experience that we do. When the Torah is taken out of the ark and taken around the shul until it's put down on the bima so it can be read, we stand up out of respect. But the question is, well, how do we know this? The Talmud always wants to know, like, this is the first Rashi. It's not enough to say this is what the law is. Well, how do we know that? So they bring a Kal V'Chomer, and they say they had already established that for what's called a Talmid Chacham, a very wise person, a Torah scholar. If a Torah scholar comes into a room, then we stand out of respect for this person. So the Talmud says, a Kal V'Chomer, if we have to stand, or we should stand, for someone who learns the Torah, how much more so should we stand for the Torah itself? That's the Kal V'Chomer. So that's also a very, very, very good example. And the last one, as you know, we've mentioned this many times, but I'll mention it again. In the Chumash, there are 10 examples in the text. In the Talmud, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of Kal V'Chomer. It's a very, very used method. And like every chapter of this book, in other words, to have a book of 700 pages and not 70,000 pages, we could only pick a few examples. But it's important to point out that this method is used all the time in the Talmud. So the last one is like a story, is that one of the greatest sages was Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah. And one time he was in the presence of the Caesar. Now, a little background is that there was a deep love-hate relationship going on between Rome and Israel. And it goes all the way back to Esav and Yaakov. And the Romans destroyed the temple, slaughtered really hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people, and putting down various rebellions. At the same time, there was a tremendous fascination among the aristocracy of Rome with Jewish thought. And therefore, in the Gemara, you have many scores and scores and scores of stories about interchanges between the sages and the Roman leaders. So this is just one of them. So the Caesar says to him, show me your God. I want to see your God. And so Rabbi Yeshua said, I can't show you my God. And so in those days, it's like, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. I want proof. Give me proof that your God exists. He said, I can't. The Caesar was upset. So he said to him, look at the sun. And the Caesar had enough brains to know that if you stare at the sun, you will burn out your retinas. So he said, I can't look right at the sun. So Rabbi Yeshua gave him a Kal V'Chomer. If you can look at the sun, which is just a small, tiny servant or channel for God's energy, how do you expect to look at God? Do you have any idea what kind of power we're talking about here? So if you're telling me you can't even look at the sun for 2 seconds, Kal V'Chomer, how can you expect to look at God? Okay, so that's it for our examples for Kal V'Chomer. Now we're going to go on to another very, very important method in the Torah, which is called Kri U'Ktiv. Kri means the way we read it. Ktiv means the way it's written. Now this is something that is handed down from Moshe Sinai. It's not something that in later generations can be added. It was part and parcel of the oral Torah from the very beginning. So what is it? And you have to see it in a printed chumash, because in the Torah you won't see it. You'll only see the Ktiv. Again, Kri means the way it's read. Ktiv means the way it's written. So if you look in the Torah, all you see is the way it's written. But when you look at a chumash, and actually it's the whole Tanakh, you will see usually in the column or right next to it in parentheses that we read it differently than the way that it's written. And the way we read it is always very, very connected. It's usually just an added letter or a missing letter, but it's a tradition. It's an oral tradition that we read it as if it says one thing, but we read it, meaning it has a different meaning. So this is like a very, very important method, but it's, like I said, it's intrinsic to the relationship between the written and the oral Torah. So the first one that we're going to do is on the bottom of page 231. And this has to do with the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth we read on Shavuos. It's a short book. It's only 4 chapters. And there are various reasons why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuos. The 2 most quoted reasons are Ruth is the great-great-great-grandmother of King David. King David passes away on Shavuot. And also there's a tradition that he conquered Jerusalem on Shavuos. So the last words of the book of Ruth, without telling the whole story, but Ruth at the end of the story marries Boaz, and she has a child. And from that child, a few generations later, comes David HaMelech. So one of the reasons that we read the book of Ruth is because it gives a lineage of King David. And King David passes away on Shavuot. A second reason that we're given is Shavuot is the harvest festival. It's when the grains, the wheat, is harvested. To this day, I had in the beginning of the Moshav, I had the merit to plow hundreds of dunam fields and to plant wheat and to be part of harvesting. And it was an incredible experience. And to this day, wheat is harvested right around Shavuos. And that's why the offering in the temple was called a mincha chadasha, a new offering from the new wheat, 2 loaves of bread from the new wheat harvest. And so before that is barley. Barley was harvested before the wheat. So again, without telling the whole story, when Ruth comes back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, from Moab, they return in at the time of the harvest. And the story plays itself out with Ruth going into the fields to pick the grains that have been left there. So that's another reason that we read the book of Ruth, because the whole story is taking place at the time of Shavuos. The third reason, and that's what we're getting to here, is there's no place in the entire Tanakh that has more examples of Kri and U'Ktiv than the book of Ruth. The Ruth has many, many examples. I want to put in before I forget, a third reason before the Kri and the U'Ktiv is because Ruth is considered like the epitome or the archetypal convert. And when we receive the Torah on Sinai, there's an idea, it's as if the entire people, in a sense, went through a conversion process to receive the Torah. And that's why the parsha where the Torah is given is Parashat Yitro, because he's the other archetypal convert. But let's get back to the Kri and the U'Ktiv. So one of the examples is, we know that Ruth was incredibly devoted and loyal to her mother-in-law. Incredibly devoted and loyal. And so it's really Naomi's instructions to Ruth how she should go about meeting with Boaz and, in a sense, suggesting that they get married. And so when she gives the instructions to Ruth, so it's written as if Ruth is to be doing these things. So it says, and you shall bathe and anoint yourself and put on your clothes and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But the way that we read it as if it's being commanded to Ruth, but the way that's written is as if Naomi is actually the one going to the threshing floor. And so what this points out, and I didn't say this before, that in most cases, the way that it's written has the deeper meaning. The way that it's read is the more logical storyline way that we would read this verse. The way that it's written is hinting that it's something deeper. So we read it as like I said, and you shall bathe, and you shall anoint yourself, and you shall put on clothes and go down. But it's written as if it's Naomi, in a sense, giving instructions to herself. And without going into all of the examples, this happens a number of times, and there are a whole string of the way that it's written and the way that it is read. Now, like I said, that if you go through the whole Tanakh, you'll find many, many examples of U'Ktiv and Kri, and each one, the way that it's written, that's how it's written in the Torah, but we read it differently. We read it different. And the one reading the Torah has to know this, because if he read it the way that he's looking at the Torah, he's reading the Ktiv, but it needs to be the Kri. So here you have an example, and why it's so important on Shavuos is because on Shavuos we receive the 10 Commandments, which is like a model for us receiving the whole Torah. That's what we say. We received the whole Torah at Sinai, but really it took 40 years for the whole Torah to be given over. Like in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, there are many new mitzvot, and this is only coming after 40 years in the desert. But still, the idea is that we received the whole Torah on Sinai. That's the written Torah. But we also received the oral Torah. And so the book of Ruth, this method of Kri and U'Ktiv, the way it's read and the way it's written, is one of the most important examples of we'll call it the synergy or the unification of the written and the oral Torah. Because the way we read it is the oral tradition. The way it's written is the written tradition. And they cannot be separated. And maybe more than any other method, this is showing the oral Torah and the written Torah coming together. Okay, the next one is a very interesting one. This is part of our prayers every day. And we read the 100th Psalm. And that's where we say, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Mizmor l'toda, a psalm of thanksgiving. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. And then it says, Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. Hu asanu, he made us, and we are his. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. Now the way it's written, the way that we read it is lamed vav, which means him. He made us, and we are his. But the way that it's written is with lamed aleph, which means no, not. So the way we would read that is he made us and not us making us. I hope that's clear to everyone. Again, the difference between he made us and we are his. He made us and not us, meaning, and we didn't make ourselves. So you would say, well, who would say such a thing? Well, if you look in the modern world, so there's this idea called a self-made person, a self-made person. And obviously there are many atheists in the world and don't hold that God made us. We just, I don't know where we came from. If you're an atheist, I guess from a virus or a cell or a salamander or a monkey or whatever. But the idea is that many, many people live their lives according to the way that it's written. He made us, but it has to be pointed out, we didn't make ourselves. God made us. And that, again, that seems obvious to us, but in the world, that's not so obvious. It's not so obvious. Many, many people live their lives and throw their weight around with this attitude is, I'm a self-made person. I can do what I want, when I want, where I want, with whom I want. I call the shots here. So this is a Oh, I have to read this because my wife just put a chat where there's a verse that Paro says. What is it again? Hold on. I usually don't interrupt for chats, but I have to do this one. Pharaoh said, the Nile is mine and I made myself. Because Paro was seen, in a sense, as a self-made person. That's what he thought. And he was actually worshipped as a god. People believed that the people who sat in the throne of Paro, and how many kings have Nebuchadnezzar declared himself God? Antiochus at some point declared himself God. So this is a very, very important Ktiv and Kri. Again, we read it in the way that is logical. He made us and we are his. But there's a deep hint here in the way it's written with Lamed Aleph. The next one is, it's very appropriate because tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh Adar. Now this year we have 2 Adars, but it means that Purim is approximately 6 weeks away. So the next Ktiv and Kri is on page 234. And this is a very, very important one. Very, very important. It says at the end of the Megillah, so it's giving instructions of how we're going to keep Purim through the generations. And it says, Kimu v'kiblu, it was established and it was accepted that we would be keeping the days of Purim throughout the generations. So in the text, we read it, both of them in the plural. Kimu actually means they established it and they received it. But the way that it's written, it's Kimu v'kibel in the singular, not kiblu. Kibel in the singular. So again, we read it in it's the more logical, because if the first one's in the plural and it's talking about all of the people, then it makes sense that in receiving it, all the people received it, but it's written in the singular. So what's being hinted to here? So actually, this is a very, very important concept connected to Purim, is we're told that at Purim, we received the Torah even more than we received it at Sinai. Because at Sinai, if you remember the famous Midrash, where it says that the people stood at the bottom of the mountain, at the foot of the mountain. And so the Midrash says that God held the mountain over their heads and said, if you receive the Torah today, great. And if not, this will be your burial place. Meaning, I'm going to drop the mountain on you. So this is a whole discussion, because we always quote the idea of Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do and we'll hear. The epitome of free will. We're choosing to do the Torah even before we understand. This is like the highest level of free will and dedication. And yet the Midrash comes and says that God held the mountain over their heads. So what is it teaching us? It's teaching, without going too deep into it, that even though we did accept it, God wanted us to understand that there's a certain level where we didn't have any choice. We are the children of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. We have a certain destiny, We have a certain mission in the world, and it is what God has determined. And so along with having free will and receiving the Torah, God also wanted to know that really it's beyond choice. There's certain things that it's your destiny. So we're told that not only did the people accept upon themselves this holiday called Purim, but we have to understand the story of Purim is happening approximately 900 years after the giving of the Torah. And this is the first holiday that's added to the Jewish calendar. 900 years is a long time. That's more than triple the age of the United States. And that's only a little section of Jewish history. So it's 900 years later. So when they add a holiday, it's much more than that. They established it, the kiblu, and they received upon themselves the Torah in a way that there was no forcing here. It was complete free will. And we're told also, because we made this point before, some point out that we had received the written Torah, but at Purim time, we also, this is the beginning, at Purim time is the beginning of the Anshe Knesset Gedola, of the men of the Great Assembly. And they already started making all kinds of laws that not only exist till today, but define how we live our Judaism. So the people took upon themselves not just the written Torah, but also the oral Torah. So what is hinted to, though, that it's written in the singular? Because at Har Sinai, so we're told, V'yichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. When we came to the Mount Sinai, it says that Israel camped across from the mountain. And one of the most famous Rashis in the entire Chumash, he points out it's written in the singular, V'yichan. It should have said V'yichanu, that they camped, but it's written in the singular. So he points out, Ki'ish echad b'lev echad, like one, they camped like one person with one heart. In other words, they came to Sinai and they received the Torah totally united. So here, the Ktiv is written in the singular to tell us that after the story, even though during the story, the Jews were not completely together. That was the whole thing, that some of the Jews went to the feast of Achashverosh, and that began the whole, all the from a spiritual point of view, all of the troubles. So here it's written in the singular to point out it's like Mount Sinai. They received it Ki'ish echad b'lev echad. Now we're going to end with one more. There's so many more good ones, but we're going to end with maybe one of the most important ones of all of them, though it's not technically a Kri U'Ktiv, but it's the most important of all of them, the way we read something and the way it's written. And this has to do with the four-letter name of God. That at the burning bush, when God was instructing Moshe, and Moshe was saying, who should I tell sent me? And Moshe was like prying and prodding to understand more God's motivation and the whole story here. And so God reveals that the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is Zeh Shemi Le'olam. This is my name forever. The four-letter name of God. Now the sages point out Zeh Shemi Le'olam. Le'olam means forever, but you can also read it Le'e'elam. to hide. This is my name to hide. Meaning that we don't pronounce the 4-letter name of God the way it's written. And in fact, we don't really even have the tradition at this point of how we do say it. The only times it was said the way that it's written was in the temple, and only at special times by the Kohanim. So this is in a sense, it's not technically a Kri U'Ktiv, meaning the way we read it is different than the way it's written. But the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is written those 4 letters, but we pronounce it Adonai. We don't pronounce it the way that it's written. So this is just a very, very important idea. And obviously the sages understood that this is how it was supposed to be. But here they found we'll call it the hint in the verse itself, Zeh Shemi Le'olam. And they said, don't read it. Remember a couple chapters ago, is don't read it this way, read it that way. So they said, don't read it Le'olam, meaning forever, read it Le'elam, to hide it. So I think that's where we will end for tonight. We'll end with a bracha that we should continue to delve into the Torah. We should continue to read the Torah the way it's read, and we should read it on the inside the way it's written. And when we do so, like we said in the beginning, and we take the time to meditate on what we are learning, then the hope is that it will really become a part of us, and it will help us be better people and to be closer to Hashem.